The last thing we're going to talk about in this lesson is sampling, or actually acquiring participants for your study and different ways of doing that, along with the pros and the cons of each type of way. So the first kind of sampling procedures we're going to talk about fall under the heading of bias sampling. That is, there is something inherently biased about each of these methods of sampling, although if you look at it in terms of the large bulk of many studies in the literature, this is often the way things are done. And we're going to talk about why, as we discuss each one. So samples of convenience are basically just as they sound. It's sort of going about the convenient way of gathering people into your study. So if you want to learn about, say, note-taking, good ways and bad ways of note-taking, you simply scoop up everybody in your experimental class and you see if they won't participate in your study. And this way, they are basically known as accidental samples, or samples where it's convenient, everybody is there, they're easily recruited into your study. Of course, samples of convenience have drawbacks, as do each of the next two, in terms of generalizability. You don't know if the people who've participated in your study are in some ways the same or different than the entire population at your college. Maybe there's something about majors in psychology that affect their particular study habits. Maybe there's something about the type of person that selects a psychology major that alters or has something to do with their particular note-taking or study habits. Volunteerism is another type of bias sampling. And you can think of this as when you issue a call for volunteers. If you stand outside the library and you kind of ask people to participate if they have time, if you put up a flyer and you ask for volunteers, these are basically people who want to be in the study, who sort of respond to your call to participate. But of course there are problems with that. Individuals may volunteer for different reasons. If you're doing a study on some particular kind of health issue, maybe the people who will volunteer are people who aren't in as good of health. They want to know maybe why they're not in good health or to find out more about that. Or maybe it's people who think they're in exceptional health and they think they would be a good volunteer for your study. Volunteers can also be maybe more persistent than the general population. So if you are asking people to volunteer for your study, maybe only the people who feel they have time, who are motivated, who will be persistent, are going to be the people in your study, and that might not necessarily mean they have all the characteristics of the general sample that you are sort of wanting to describe in some way. The last method of bias sampling is called snowball sampling, and this is sometimes used particularly when participants who have the quality you're interested in can be hard to find. So say you are interested in finding people who are recovering from substance abuse. It might be difficult to locate a lot of people who are in recovery. So maybe you go and you find some people who are in a recovery program and they agree to participate. And you would ask them, can you help me locate more people who might want to participate in my study? So that's called snowball sampling, where you have a bunch of people with the trait or characteristic you're interested in, and you ask them maybe to find you more people, supply you more people who might be interested in participating. And this too has its biases, in that it's unclear whether the people who've agreed to participate are the same as all of the people with the trait or characteristic you're interested in, or if they have some particular characteristic where they wish to volunteer more, that there are people who have traits within the population that you're unable to study because they do not come forward. So the bias sampling procedures, as you might sort of guess, are often used because they are easy. It is easy to get a sample of convenience, where you just sort of go wherever there are people and you say, hey, will you fill out my questionnaire? It's easy to sort of get a snowball sample if you have a particularly difficult population for recruitment, to sort of say, hey, can you get more people and bring them into my study? It makes recruiting a little bit easier. However, the unbiased sampling allows you to sort of generalize a lot more from the sample that you've obtained to the general population. It really means that when you use unbiased sampling, that you can say everybody within a population had an equal chance of sort of being included in my sample, and so therefore I can generalize from my sample to the larger population with a lot more confidence. Of course, the procedures involved in doing unbiased sampling can be more complicated, and they can take more time, and complication in time equals more difficulty maybe for the experimenter. So simple random sampling is the sort of simplest design that you can use with unbiased sampling. And that is that every member of a population is given an equal chance of being included in your sample. So say you were interested in what the students think at the college of the new dorm being built. You would see to it that each member of the population, every potential student, could end up in your sample based on chance, probability. You sort of either pulling their name off of a large list, or numbering a list with numbers and then randomly generating numbers and pulling the student assigned to a particular number off that list. So if you have a list of 10,000 students, maybe you randomly select 500 of those names, and you would then contact those 500 students as a simple random sample of the entire population. If you have a sort of adequate sample size, that you've pulled enough students and you've included them in your study based on chance, everybody has the same chance and probability of being in your study, you might be able to generalize then to the entire population. So from that smaller sample of 500, you might get a very good idea of what the general college population thinks about the new dorms. Stratified random sampling is basically when you need to divide the population into strata, or you need to maybe sample from categories. So if you think about the population of Mercy College, it's weighted a little bit more heavily towards women than men. So if you did a completely simple random sample and just pulled 500 names off of a list of the 10,000 students, the problem is that there are many more women than there are men, and you want to make sure that your random sampling reflects that, because if you had 50% men, 50% women, and the actual numbers at the college are more like 70% and 30%, your ability to generalize will be a little bit off. So basically what you do is you separate the names into strata. So you have a list of women and you have a list of men, and then you draw randomly from each strata in the percentages and proportions of which your participants exist. So if you have 7,000 women and 3,000 men, you say, okay, I'm going to instead sample 70 women and 30 men. So from that 70 and 30, you are still randomly pulling names out of the pool of women and randomly pulling the names out of the pool of men, but you make sure that when you do so, you do it at a 70-30 ratio. The last type of sampling is cluster sampling. And this is basically where maybe there's a really big population, and that population tends to exist in groups or clusters. Or you'd get more information that way rather than just surveying people as individuals. So say you want to find out what schools, what individuals think about the new Common Core testing. And you want to find out about that across New York State. Well, New York State is very, very large, and it might be difficult to do a sort of random, simple random sampling of individuals and have that be meaningful. You know that across the state, different areas think differently maybe about the test. So what you decide to do is to create clusters. Or you can think of it maybe as districts, right? In New York City, we have different districts for schools. So maybe you say, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw samples of clusters, randomly draw samples of clusters, and then I will contact the individuals within that cluster. So maybe you have 1,000 districts of school existing across the state of New York. You randomly pick districts and you decide to sample the individuals within that district. So in that case, you would also get a wide smattering of attitudes across the state, drawing from different districts across the entire state. So these are just some of the unbiased sampling techniques you can use. Again, because the samples are random, they are subject to slightly less error, and they are subject to greater generalizability to the general population. But as you might guess, doing random sampling is a little bit more time intensive, and it can take a little bit longer. Although it improves the outcome of whatever it is you find in terms of data, these techniques are not used quite as often as the unbiased techniques, again, because the unbiased techniques can be quicker and a little bit more simple.